Welcome. In this video on the causes of the Civil War, we will look at the Secession Crisis following Abraham Lincoln's election in November of 1860, leading up through the start of the Civil War after the firing on Fort Sumter. After Lincoln is elected, we've already spoken about the Southern response and how secession was threatened because of that key position Lincoln had opposing the extension of slavery in the federal territories, which touched on an economic and emotional issue, slavery, which touched on a perceived infringement upon states' rights. The Supreme Court had already ruled that Lincoln's position was effectively unconstitutional already, and the fact that this was a sectional issue and not necessarily a party issue, it was one that divided a whole section of the country against the other. Is secession in American history perceived as this uniquely treasonous act? That is definitely not how those who supported secession saw it. They saw themselves in a long line of American tradition, going back to one of the big themes in this course of the hearkening back to the Enlightenment, the theories of John Locke, how when a government becomes destructive of people's rights, they have the right, the duty to overthrow that government. That goes back to the Declaration of Independence. Among our first presidents, when John Adams had the Alien and Sedition Acts, you had Jefferson and Madison write the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions about standing up to federal power. Even when you had the Articles, which were supposed to be perpetual, and you had the writing of the Constitution, in a way, one could argue that there's a long tradition of seceding from Britain, of seceding illegally from the government of the Articles to form the Constitution, of standing up to the federal government. The New England states threatened maybe to secede during the War of 1812. South Carolina nullified or tried to nullify federal tariff law in 1830. But the election of Lincoln and his holding to a position that most Southerners strongly disagreed with, and the Supreme Court had effectively ruled unconstitutional, made them fear for the loss of slavery with all of its economic and social consequences. And it also made them believe that perhaps Lincoln had no regard for the law because, again, they were and their rights, because he was promoting a position that was against the Dred Scott court case. At least that is the approach that they take. How does secession happen? Well, the election's in November. In late December, South Carolina proposes a resolution, and they have a convention to secede. People come out to vote, and in this frenzied moment, they vote to secede, to break away from the United States, which was debated as to whether this was permitted. But of course, remember, the Constitution is silent on the subject. Whereas the Articles of Confederation had strictly prohibited doing what they did when the states signed the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution did not strictly forbid this. And so they did not believe they were doing anything inherently illegal, wrong, or that they didn't have the right to do under the Constitution. Many others, though, believed that was no way to run a nation, and that it was implied, and that the current Constitution did not have any of the same problems that the Articles or that British rule had. But 6 states follow South Carolina in January, and one by one they hold votes to secede, and they vote in favor of secession. President Buchanan takes no strong position. He is on his way out, and for that reason, many presidential lists, when historians rank the success or strength of presidents, Buchanan habitually ranks near the bottom because of his lack of leadership during his lame duck, for other things too, but especially his lack of leadership during this lame duck session when the U.S. Congress is not in session, Lincoln has not been inaugurated yet, And Buchanan effectively takes no stand on this issue of secession. He doesn't, endorse it. He doesn't condemn it. He's going to let Lincoln handle that. And so even before Lincoln is inaugurated, he is still just president-elect. He has won the election, but he's not the president yet. In the meantime, the Southern states act quickly. Before Lincoln is even the president, they found a Confederate States of America. They write a Confederate Constitution, which is basically the U.S. Constitution. A couple of restrictions on preventing tariffs, a couple of tweaks to how the president's elected and the president's term and the veto, and a strong guarantee of slavery. Other than that, it is paragraph by paragraph, article by article, line by line, the U.S. Constitution, which, again, they would not so much consider plagiarism as saying it's the perfected version of the Union they wanted, the Southern whites. And they vote for and elect, and kind of like George Washington, they select, because they don't have a full nationwide election, they select, in a way, Jefferson Davis, the senator from Mississippi, to be their president. And they establish a capital, actually, at Montgomery, Alabama, at their state house, because Virginia has not yet seceded. Virginia is a Union state still. And so, and in all of the southern states that have seceded so far, they take over almost all of the federal installations, post offices, even military bases, arsenals, and things like that. And basically the locals take control, and the Union troops, the U.S. troops, leave. There is a terrible crisis, and many Northerners want to do anything to avoid the country splitting into two, or a civil war, if people could imagine it at this point. And so many Northerners supported amending the Constitution. The actual 13th Amendment to our Constitution is the amendment right after the Civil War that abolishes slavery. And it was ratified and passed. But right before the Civil War, there was proposed the original 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which was an unrepealable guarantee of slavery, free from interference by the federal government, that a state had an unrepealable guarantee to have slavery so long as it wanted, so that even if a supermajority of all the other states wanted to abolish slavery in the United States, there would be an amendment to the U.S. Constitution prohibiting that. It got the support of 2/3 of both houses, the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate. It went out to the states. Nearly half of all the states signed it, mostly northern states, not as much New England, where abolitionism was stronger, but most moderate northern states signed. It would have become law if the southern states had thought it was good enough. This is how far the North was willing to go to prevent the country splitting in two, or to prevent a civil war. Was an unrepealable guarantee of slavery. Most Northerners willing to go that far. By this point, the reason it really didn't pass is it was not enough for Southerners. They had tasted this, they used the analogy. The tea has been thrown in the harbor. It's another Boston Tea Party. The revolution is on. This is going to be glorious and great, and this is going to be better, and we're tired of the political wrangling with these Northerners, and we prefer this to even staying in the Union, even with such a powerful protection. Lincoln then is inaugurated in March. Recall back then, Inauguration Day was not in January as it has been for the last 80 years, but in March. And so by then, 4 months after the election, roughly 2 months after secession gets going, Lincoln has a few options, right? There doesn't have to be a war. He could let them go. There could be two countries. And maybe one day they reunite, maybe they negotiate, but he could let them go. His second option, he could immediately declare war, say that they are rebels, and immediately declare war. He fears, though, that he'll be blamed. No one is yet sure what should happen, and so he could go to war. He could join them, negotiate with them, try to work something out. Or he could do what he does, which is try to retain the last two federal installations. And the most meaningful one was a military base, a fortress, that was protecting Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. It's on an island in the harbor, and all of its guns point out toward the ocean. This was built, or at least refortified, in response to the War of 1812, where the British fleet was destroying American cities from the sea, and so most American cities had these elaborate fortifications erected in order to protect the city. And so there were still U.S. troops flying the U.S. flag on this fort in an island right at the heart of secession, where the first place that secession really took hold, which was Charleston. And the conflict begins as the South Carolina militia gives an ultimatum and says that they need to surrender the fort or they'll be fired upon. They ask Lincoln for guidance, and Lincoln tells them not to surrender. They're going to resupply, that Lincoln will not send any more cannons, any more ammunition, and any more men, but they were resupplying Fort Sumter with food and water. And that was not good enough. They had hoped to starve them out, but they keep getting resupplied by the sea. And so when the time passes in April of 1861, the militia of South Carolina fires on the fort all night. It surrenders in the morning. The soldiers are captured and then paroled, released back to the north. There's, in theory, not a war yet. But the news of this, it's like a Pearl Harbor, it's like a 9/11, it's like an event that just sends shock waves through the country. The Southerners, this is when that quote comes about. The tea is thrown in the harbor, the revolution is on. In the North, it's like a lightning bolt, and that these men in South Carolina saw a fort flying the stars and stripes, the American flag, and they shot at and fired on those brave men until they lowered that flag in surrender. That is war. You've made war on the American flag. You've made war on the United States, and that can't stand. But it's a lightning bolt north and south. Whatever side you were already leaning toward, it pushed everyone out of the middle and toward one side or the other. So the rest of the upper South secedes, and 4 more slave states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, secede after Fort Sumter. 4 border states almost secede. Delaware takes a secession vote, and by not a terribly wide margin, votes to stay with the Union. In Maryland, surrounding Washington, D.C., the government under Lincoln proclaims martial law. They use the military to essentially prevent a vote. Same thing in Missouri, where they have to close the legislature to prevent them demanding a vote for fear that slave states Maryland and Missouri would secede if they were given a chance. But the Union Army prevents such a vote from happening. Kentucky declares neutrality, whatever that means. And you have a quote here from Abraham Lincoln that Kentucky was a slave state that the governor declared neutrality, meaning that they would not let Kentuckians fight against either American side, and if either northern troops or southern troops invaded Kentucky, then Kentucky would join the other side. They were going to try to play Belgium in this. What ended up happening is southern troops invaded Kentucky slightly before Union troops, and so Kentucky, even though for many months was neutral, they end up staying with the Union. And so this was critical that these border states end up staying with the Union, but they were not so sure, and it was very close. What happens as a result of Fort Sumter? Lincoln takes bold action, makes a call for 70,000 volunteers, a huge army to suppress the rebellion, takes emergency executive power, suspends habeas corpus, which the Constitution gives him the right to do in the event of rebellion, and can throw people in jail without a trial, a lot of times newspapermen who are writing against the government. The Supreme Court says he can't do it. He ignores them. In the end, Lincoln is the linchpin that holds the Union together, and for this reason is regarded as such a powerful and great president. The Union comprises a plan called the Anaconda Plan to try to win a war against the South, where they drive on the new rebel capital at Richmond in the east. They make war down the Mississippi River in the west and drive into Tennessee, and they use the Navy to blockade and strangle the South. It looked like a lopsided war as the Union possessed an enormous amount of the wealth and economy of the country, but we'll talk about that next time. Thanks for watching.